Nintendo has been known to release a lot of crazy and fun video game devices, and one of those devices was something they didn't think would work over here in North America, or perhaps anywhere outside of Japan. And of course what I'm talking about is the Famicom disk drive. This little box right here is filled with so much gaming goodness that you might be shocked that it didn't come out anywhere else. Let's take a closer look at this thing. Now, as I said, the Famicom disk drive was exclusively sold in Japan, and being that the disk drive is an older system, and often importing consoles from other countries can be a little bit of a hassle, a company called Samurai Buyer reached out to us to help us get our hands on this sucker right here. Samurai Buyer provides an intermediary service that you can use at auction sites like Yahoo Japan, and easily on our very first try on the Japanese auction world, not only were we able to get a Famicom with the disk drive add-on, but we were also able to get a whole bunch of Famicom disk drive games. Now let's take a look at what we picked up. The Famicom is a much older video game system, so of course if you go to play any of these disk drive games, well, the quality really isn't going to be as high as you might expect. At least for modern gamers anyway that are used to those wonderful 1080p visuals, or 4K nowadays. But basically what we wanted to do was capture the games in the highest quality possible. So what we did is we went out and bought a system called the AVS from Retro USB. The AVS is an FPGA based system that allows you to play NES and Famicom games at a much higher resolution. Now, there's a whole interesting and complex way into how they're doing it, but all you need to know is that the games are being projected at a higher resolution, so that's how you're seeing all these games played right now. Collecting classic NES or Famicom games is a pretty common thing that a lot of gamers do, and normally when you go out and find a game, you just look at the label and you know what it is that you have in your hands. But you see, that's not the same thing when it comes to Famicom disc games, because these games may have been rewritten at a kiosk in Japan at some point in the past, meaning that whatever game you see in your hand may not be what it says on the label. This makes it kind of interesting because you might find out that you have something completely different and awesome, or you might have something that totally sucks. Unfortunately, we don't know what games we have in this box, but we're pretty excited to find out, because while it could be crap, it may also be a lost hidden gem from Nintendo's past. This is Mukashi Banashi Shin Onigashima, and I most likely butchered that entire title. This is a text adventure game, at least as far as I can tell, and there's really not much more I can tell you beyond that. And this is one of the things you're gonna have to worry about when you're getting a bunch of games being sent in a big bundle from Japan. Some games you're just not gonna be able to play, not because you can't understand what you're supposed to do, but because the entire way you play the game is by reading text and dialogue. And this is just one of those games that's going to be a barrier, and unless you learn Japanese, you won't be able to play it. But consider this, a lot of the games we got in this box we could play because at this time period there was more of an attraction to arcade style games and less on dialogue and reading ones. As long as you know what's going on in the game briefly, even if you have to pass a scene or two, you likely could play it. But this is just one of the off examples where that simply isn't going to happen. Before there was Super Mario Kart, there was Famicom Grand Prix F1 Race. Now this game here is a little bit more complex than your average racing game, and to be fair, it hasn't really aged that gracefully. Overall though, it's a really interesting experience to see a game where you can buy vehicles, kind of slightly get better versions as you go along, and race as hard as you can. This is trying to not be just an average racing game, but more like a Grand Prix F1 racing game, which is a little bit different. Traditionally, racing games just have you picking any car and going around the circle, but with this top-down perspective, it kind of gives you a different feel for the game that really wasn't done very much in the time. But there are games that did get released in North America, like Micro Machines and RC Pro-Am, that kind of did this, but just a little bit better and a little bit more arcadey. But this one here was trying to do something different, and it's kind of interesting to see. Famicom Grand Prix is cool and all, but Famicom Grand Prix 2 3D Hot Rally, well, that game's on an entirely different level. Unlike the first game's top-down perspective, this one takes place directly behind the vehicle, giving you a better view of what's coming at you from down the road. The flickering you're seeing at the bottom of the screen there is something you don't see on older style CRT screens, but on our modern television screens being upscaled to 1080p, well, you're gonna see that quite a lot. And although you might think it gets irritating to look at, after a couple minutes of playing the game, I honestly didn't even pay attention anymore. The gameplay is so addictive, it just pulls you into the experience and you just don't see it. All of the interesting customization options and purchase options that you had in the first game pretty much repeat here, but something else is going on. Unlike the very first game where you couldn't really tell what universe it was taking place in, this one I think without a doubt pretty much shows you. This is a bush that has a face on it. This is a street lamp that has a face on it. This is a rock that has a face on it. Do you see what I'm saying here? This is the Super Mario universe. Before Super Mario Kart, this is what we got. But unfortunately, this game never came out in North America because apparently, and this isn't a joke, the people working at Nintendo of America at the time thought this game was too childish. For real, they thought this game, with its complexity, its vehicle purchasing options, its very kinda hard difficulty, and its path options in the track where you can pick between going left and right at certain points and you have to get repair sections so that you can actually keep your car going, they thought this was too childish. I don't even know where to begin with that. And you know what? Neither did the developers, because after they brought this to America and realized nobody wanted it, they went back and they worked on another concept. And you know what that concept was? F-Zero. That's right, folks. When they went back home to Japan, instead of sulking in the corner and being upset about their game not making it to North America, they worked on the most hardcore racing game that eventually would lead to the creation of Super Mario Kart as well, due to its use of Mode 7 and the way that it projected racing. This right here is why F-Zero exists. This game. That's amazing. Hey look, it's ice hockey. Who doesn't love ice hockey? One of the biggest things I love about this game is that I'm not a really big fan of hockey in general, but when you play it on this version, it's just a lot of fun. You got a bunch of different distinct characters who have their own attributes, and it's a very easy game to understand and play. And on the Famicom disk drive, it plays just like it did on the original Famicom and the NES release. So if you're a big fan of ice hockey, this is the exact same experience. You're not missing anything. This is Professional Mahjong Goku. Now personally, I've never been a very big Mahjong player, but I know there's a lot of people out there that like the game. But even if you really did like the game, I wouldn't recommend importing this one, because honestly, the complexity of getting a Famicom disk drive to play this game is a little bit too much. You could easily find a Famicom Malone version or even one on the NES, and it'd probably be just as good. So yeah, I don't really recommend this one too much. Now this game right here is called Baseball, which you probably recognize being an original title on the NES. And believe it or not, this game here was also released on a cartridge before it came to the Famicom disk system. And this is something that's kind of interesting with Famicom disk games, because some of them were actually brought over from original cartridge releases. Now the reason they did this is, well, I don't really know, but I guess they did it because they could fit one game on one side, they could flip the disc over and have another game on the other side, which I guess is kind of a value pack type of thing, but there was just a lot of people out there that wanted to get more games on their Famicom disk drive, and this was just one of the ways to do it. So up next, we got a game that's got a little bit of a history to it. This is called The Adventures of Chatran. Now personally, I didn't know what this was, but apparently it's based off of a film called The Adventures of Milo and Otis, which was released sometime in the 80s. But see, this is actually a very important, at least franchise to some degree, because at the time of the original Japanese release of the film, it was the third highest grossing film ever in Japan. So they released a game that was exclusive to the Famicom disk system, and that's what this is. I don't know much about the characters in the game other than the fact that it's a cat and he's going on adventures and stuff, but it is a pretty phenomenally bad game. Doesn't play very well, but it does seem to have these really weird bush physics that is something you really don't see often in any game, really. But at the end of the day, the game doesn't play very well, and I think even for the time that it came out, it was probably a major disappointment. Volleyball, a game where you volley balls. Not a big fan of the sport personally, but I know there's a lot of people out there that might enjoy this game possibly. I don't, so this is really there just to show you that the game exists on the Famicom disk drive. You're either better for knowing that, or worse. This is pro wrestling, one of the most exciting games ever made on the disk drive, and it doesn't work. Unfortunately, when we got this disc, well, it had a crack in it from the bottom to the top, which means that we shouldn't really be putting this in the disk drive because it may damage the disk drive itself, or it might break to pieces inside, and we wouldn't be able to put in another game. So unfortunately, this is one of the things that's going to happen when you're collecting games, but you probably should be looking for cracks before you get them anyway. This is Exciting Billiard, and this is a part of the Exciting Sports series from Konami back when they weren't evil. Now, when they released this game back in 1987, it was a really interesting thing because, you see, a lot of other games treated the sport more with a kind of degree of professionalism, but in this game, you're playing against other pool hustlers and take their money. That's right, this is a serious game for adults. But anyway, the game itself actually has some pretty fun gameplay elements to it that you normally wouldn't have seen in other billiard or pool-like games. For instance, this one here has a first-person view for the balls. That way you know exactly where you're going to hit the ball and give you a little bit more of a feel that you don't really see with normal pool games, at least of this era. I gotta say, I didn't think I was going to like this game, but I ended up liking it a lot. Which is funny, considering that it's all about a game I'm not really good at playing in real life. What's this? Ultraman? Well, of course it's not Ultraman, because if it was, that would mean it'd be a game that might be interesting to play. Instead, it's Othello. You know Othello, don't you? It's just reversey. You know, that game with the little pieces that go over one another. It doesn't really matter. It's not that fun of a game, and although I know some people really enjoy it, it's definitely not one of the reasons to own the Famicom disk drive. This is Igo Kiroban Takioku, another Othello game, but this time with ninjas. Nothing's really changed here, but you got these really cool characters in the top right. That's gotta count for something, right? Golf. Well, we've seen this game on the NES, and you know what? It's not my favorite. I'm not really a big fan of golf games, and this one particularly really irritated me while I was playing it. But at the end of the day, what you're looking at is essentially the same golf game you probably already know on the NES. The only real difference here is now you've got loading times. Isn't that fun? The cover of this game might seem deceptive at first because you may assume it's actually about calling people over the phone, but it's not. This is Miho Nakayama's Heartbeat High School, a game that actually has a pretty interesting history to it. At face value, this might seem like one of the first romancing simulators ever made, and it actually was, but it goes deeper than that. Because you see, Hironobu Sakaguchi, the creator of Final Fantasy, actually helped make this game. And so did Yoshio Sakamoto, who was the co-creator of Metroid. And also on top of all of that, the music was partially created by the original composer of the first Final Fantasy game. The woman on the front of the case here was actually a well-known idol in Japan and also a movie star, and that's the entire reason why they made this game with her in it. But honestly, I wish I could tell you a lot more, but the entire game is in Japanese and it was never translated, so it's very difficult for me to really get into it. But I promise you, some point in the future, we're probably going to do an entire episode on this game because it's got a lot of interesting things going on in it. This is Exciting Basketball, and to be fair, not much of this is really exciting to me because I'm not a very big fan of basketball to begin with. We did get this game in the NES and it was known as Double Dribble, but I've never been a fan of that version either, so if you really did like this game, here's some footage of what it originally looked like on the Japanese Famicom. Now here's an interesting game. This is called Nazo no Kabe Block Kuzushi. Now this game here in the West is known as something completely different, the much more simpler title, Crackout. At its core, what you're looking at here is an Arkanoid clone. But what I like about this one is that Godzilla is a boss character that you have to fight. You don't really see something like that in Arkanoid. The levels can be a little bit simplified and in some cases a little bit cheap, but the way you play this game and the way you experience it are actually pretty fun. You've got power-ups just like in Arkanoid, and although a lot of them are very similar, there's a couple of different ones here and there that are not exactly the same. You could write this entire game off as a simple Breakout or Arkanoid clone, but honestly, I think it's a little bit more fun than that. Did you ever think about breaking apart the pieces of your TV and putting together a live-action television show as if it was a jigsaw puzzle? No? Just me? Okay, well if I was a kid and I had this system, I would have been playing the Monitor Puzzle Connect Connection, because that's essentially what this is. You got a whole bunch of really nice pictures that are animated, and you have to put them together. Now it might be possible that I'm giving this game far too much credit for what it is, but I find it really interesting that no matter what goes on when you're moving around the pieces, everything still stays animated in the picture itself. For the NES era, this is actually really cool, but not only that, you can also make the game a little bit more complex by adding far more pieces to put onto the single puzzle that you're going for. And if you really want to have a lot more fun, keep in mind that every piece here can be rotated or flipped and just changed in a whole bunch of different ways that you probably didn't think was possible. Now, a lot of the puzzles on here are going to be pretty easy to play, at least that is until you get a little bit deeper into the game, and then you start playing with ones that really start to mess with your head. Like this. This here is insane, and I will never be able to complete it. But you can see it here being completed because the person that owned this cartridge previous to me completed it so we could see it. Now we've taken these last two games and saved the very best for the very last. This is The Legend of Zelda and Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. Now the reason why we saved these for last is because we believe that if you're gonna buy this thing, these two games may be the very reason why you even decide to buy it. Now I'm gonna assume that The Legend of Zelda and Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link are games that you really don't need to be introduced to, but if you haven't played them before, they're quintessential NES games that originated on this platform. On the Famicom disk drive, they had a lot more space for games on those discs, but not only that, they had the ability to save. That's right, folks. This is something that you didn't really see on the early Famicom games or the early NES games, because that required a battery backup, which is something they didn't do at the very beginning because of cost-saving reasons. So with a Famicom disc, not only could the game be bigger in file size, but you could also save your state depending on where the game allowed you to save. And with Zelda, that was kind of important, because you see, your adventure should be long and sprawling and going through everything you could find. So when you can save your game, you can walk away from it. Before this point, with a lot of console games, what you would get would be a password save system, but that wouldn't remember what kind of items you had in your inventory. But with this, well, you could. The exact game you left off with, you could restart again. And that's what made this technology so awesome. And the same concept is true with Zelda 2 as well, only that game is just a little bit different. But what's interesting about the Famicom disk drive versions of these games is that they both have changes that they made when they brought the games over. For instance, there's different sound effects at play. And there's also different things you can do with the Famicom version that you can't do with the NES version. Since the original Famicom has a microphone in the controller, there's a point in the game where you can scream at the microphone and it will kill all the enemies on the screen. Sure, with modern technology, that seems kind of like a gimmick, but back in the 80s, that was really groundbreaking. And that kind of experience is something you're only gonna get with the Japanese version. So if you're like me and very familiar with the first two games on the NES, playing them on this system just feels a little bit different and kind of makes you smile here and there when you notice something that isn't quite like the original that you might remember. There are a ton of games that were released on the Famicom disk drive, but in my own personal opinion, these two stand out. Because unlike a lot of the other games that do have minor differences here and there, Zelda 1 and 2 were originally intended to be played like this on this platform. So if you really want to experience them the way they were meant to be played, this is the only way to do it.
If you're a collector of Nintendo items, I can't recommend finding one of these enough. But like we said earlier in the video, using a company like Samurai Buy or anyone like that to find these things, well, you're probably going to be in an instance where you're going to find games that aren't exactly in the best working order, like that cracked disc we got. But honestly, that's just the way it's going to be. This is an old product, and a lot of those games that were released on here have been rewritten and stuff like that. Unless you can find a really good collector in Japan that took care of their stuff, there's a chance you're never really gonna quite know what you're gonna get. So keep that in mind and, well, good hunting.